Have you ever looked at the people who share your blood and realized they were nothing more than scavengers waiting for a warm body to go cold? I used to believe that family was a shield against the cruelties of the world. I thought the people you grew up with, the ones who sat at your dinner table, smiled in your holiday photos, and called you their own, were the ones who would hold your hand when the storm hit. But I was wrong. Completely, devastatingly wrong. Family isn't always a shield. Sometimes, family is the knife waiting in the dark. It was 3 days after my grandmother, Eleanor Vance, drew her last breath. 3 days. Her body hadn't even been laid to rest in the quiet, shaded plot under the old oak tree she loved so much. Her favorite dress, the navy blue one with the delicate lace collar she saved for special occasions, was still hanging in her wardrobe, smelling faintly of lavender and old paper. The funeral arrangements were barely finalized. The flowers hadn't even been ordered. Yet, there they were, sitting around her solid mahogany dining table, passing around a box of greasy takeout chicken, sipping iced tea, and signing documents that didn't belong to them. My uncle, Richard, a man whose permanent sneer could curdle fresh milk, sat at the head of the table. Beside him was his wife, Aunt Victoria, her eyes darting around the living room like a thief sizing up a jewelry store. And in the corner, typing away on his phone without a single care in the world, was my cousin Julian. And then there was me, standing in the hallway, holding a box of Grandma's old photo albums, watching the people who were supposed to be grieving line their pockets before her soul had even left the room. "It's just business, Clara," Richard said, not even looking up as he flipped through a stack of legal papers. His voice was smooth, detached, like he was negotiating a deal for a used car rather than selling his own mother's lifetime of memories. "The market in this town is peaking. If we wait until after the funeral, we miss the window." The buyer made an all-cash offer, 20% above market value, waived the inspection, and wants a fast closing. "We'd be idiots to let it sit. She isn't even in the ground yet, Uncle Richard," I said, my voice trembling, though I fought with every fiber of my being to keep it steady. The box of photo albums in my arms felt heavier than a lead weight. This was her home for 52 years. She built this garden with her own hands. Grandpa built that porch. Everything she ever loved is inside these walls. How could you put a "for sale" sign on her yard while her body is still sitting at the funeral home? Aunt Victoria scoffed, placing her fork down with a loud, irritating clatter. She wiped her mouth with a napkin and looked at me with that patronizing, fake sympathetic smile she always used when she was about to say something cruel. "Oh, sweetie," Victoria said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You're being so emotional. You've always been so sentimental, just like Eleanor. But the real world doesn't run on tears, Clara. It runs on money. Eleanor was sick for a long time. Her care wasn't cheap. Richard and I have taken on a massive burden managing her affairs, and frankly, this house is just a box of bricks. It's an asset, and right now, that asset is worth $500,000. An asset, I echoed, stepping into the dining room. I set the heavy box down on a chair, my hands shaking so badly I had to clench them into fists. This isn't an asset. This is Grandma's life. She explicitly told us, all of us, that she wanted the family to gather here for one last Sunday dinner after her service. She wanted us to say goodbye here, in her home. Well, plans change. Julian piped up from the corner, not even taking his eyes off his screen. Besides, the buyer wants possession by Friday. That means everything in this house has to be cleared out by tomorrow afternoon. So if you want any of her old junk, Clara, you better start packing it into your trunk tonight. Otherwise, the estate liquidation team is tossing it all into a dumpster. A dumpster. They were going to throw away 50 years of memories like trash. The hand-knitted blankets, the teacups she brought from her homeland, the framed letters Grandpa wrote her from overseas. All of it was being reduced to an inconveniencing hurdle standing between my family and a wire transfer. "You can't do this," I whispered, the anger finally burning through the fog of my grief. "The will hasn't even been read yet. Mr. Harrison said he would meet us after the service on Thursday. You don't have the legal authority to sell this house before the attorney presents her final testament." Uncle Richard finally leaned back in his chair. He picked up a pen, capped it with a loud click, and gave me a look of cold, calculating superiority. "Clara, let me educate you on how the real world works," Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. 5 years ago, when your grandmother started getting forgetful, she signed over power of attorney to me. I had her sign a quitclaim deed transferring the title of this property into a family trust, a trust that I control as the sole trustee. The house doesn't belong to Eleanor Vance anymore. Technically, it hasn't belonged to her for half a decade. It belongs to the trust, and as trustee, I have the absolute legal right to buy, sell, or liquidate any property under that umbrella whenever I see fit. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, his eyes narrowing. The will reading on Thursday is just a formality, Clara. A song and dance for small-minded people. There is no money left in her personal accounts. The house is sold. The deed is being recorded electronically as we speak. By the time we stand at her grave on Thursday morning, this property will belong to a commercial developer who plans to tear it down and put up luxury townhomes. Tear it down. The words hit me like a physical blow. The porch where Grandma used to sit and read to me when I was a little girl, the kitchen where she taught me how to bake bread, the garden where she spent hours planting roses in memory of my grandfather, all of it was going to be bulldozed. And the people standing with the bulldozers were her own son, her daughter-in-law, and her grandson. You tricked her, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. 5 years ago, she was already showing signs of dementia. She trusted you, Richard. She thought you were helping her pay her utility bills, and you made her sign away her life's work. Watch your tongue, Clara. Aunt Victoria snapped, her fake sweetness vanishing in an instant, replaced by sharp, vicious anger. You're an ungrateful little girl who hasn't contributed a single dime to this family. Where were you when Eleanor needed medication? Where were you when the property taxes were due? You were off living your little life, while Richard handled the hard work. I was here, I shouted, the tears finally bursting past my eyelids. I was here every single weekend. I cooked her meals. I bathed her when she couldn't walk. I sat by her bed every night for the last 6 months while you two were vacationing in Europe. You didn't pay for her care. Grandma's pension paid for her care. You didn't manage her affairs. You bled her dry. Uncle Richard stood up slowly. He was a tall man, imposing, used to intimidating people in business meetings. He walked around the table until he was standing just inches from me. You have 24 hours to take whatever personal knickknacks you want from this house, Richard said, his voice deadly quiet, laced with pure venom. After that, the locks are being changed. If I catch you on this property after 6 o'clock tomorrow evening, I will have you arrested for trespassing. Do you understand me? I looked into my uncle's eyes, searching for a single shred of humanity, a single flicker of remorse or love for his late mother. But there was nothing. Just greed. Pure, unadulterated, cold-hearted greed. You think you've won, don't you? I whispered, wiping the tears from my cheeks with the back of my hand. Richard chuckled, a dry, soulless sound. I don't think I've won, Clara. I know I've won. The law is on my side. The paperwork is signed. The money is coming. Now take your little boxes of photo albums and get out of my house. I didn't say another word. I picked up the box of photo albums, turned around, and walked out the front door, the heavy oak entrance slamming shut behind me with a sound that felt like a door closing on my entire life. As I stood on the driveway in the cold evening air, looking up at the glowing windows of the home that had sheltered 3 generations of my family, my heart broke into 1,000 pieces. But beneath that unbearable pain, something else began to ignite. A tiny, cold flame of absolute, unwavering resolve. They thought they had outsmarted everyone. They thought they had looted an old lady's life work before her body was even cold in the ground. They thought they were untouchable because they had legal papers, power of attorney, and a squad of expensive lawyers. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Eleanor Vance was not a foolish woman. She was sharp, she was patient, and above all else, she knew exactly who her children were. And in 4 days at the reading of her will, my family was going to learn that lesson the hard way. How would you like to proceed? Since this script is structured for a 1-hour total video, we have 5 to 6 more detailed sections to cover: the secret preparation, the funeral, the will reading, the 2-word letter, and the aftermath/justice. The night before the funeral, the rain came down in sheets, slamming against the windshield of my small sedan as I sat parked at the edge of Grandma Street. I watched through the blur of water droplets as a massive, industrial-sized dumpster was rolled onto her front driveway. 2 men in rain ponchos were tossed inside, hauling out her life in black plastic contractor bags. Antique chairs she bought at flea markets in the 70s, framed embroidery she spent winters stitching, stacks of her favorite mystery novels, all of it tossed into the back of a truck like worthless debris. Uncle Richard stood on the covered porch, wearing a yellow raincoat, holding a clipboard and checking off boxes as if he were managing a warehouse clear out instead of throwing away his mother's legacy. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a text message from Mr. Harrison, Grandma's longtime estate lawyer. "Clara, I saw the property transfer notice. Meet me at my office tomorrow at 8 a.m. before the service. Bring your grandmother's leather journal." My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. The leather journal. 3 weeks before she died, when her voice was barely more than a scratchy whisper and her body had surrendered to the hospital bed, Grandma had pulled me close. Her paper-thin hand had squeezed mine with surprising strength. "Clara," she had whispered, her eyes clear and sharp despite the morphine clouding her body. "Richard thinks he has stolen my house. He thinks because my hands shake, my mind is gone. But a wolf who wears a suit is still a wolf. When the time comes, open the blue leather diary in my nightstand. Do not give it to anyone. Take it straight to Arthur Harrison." I had retrieved that diary the very night she died, slipping it into my bag while Richard and Victoria were already arguing over who got her pearl necklace. I picked up the diary from my lap. It was small, bound in worn blue calfskin, sealed with a small bronze latch. I hadn't opened it. I had promised her I wouldn't. But holding it in that dark, rain-soaked car, feeling the weight of it in my hands, I knew that whatever was inside was the spark that would either light our way or burn everything to the ground. The next morning, the sky was a bruised shade of purple-gray. The rain had slowed to a miserable, icy drizzle. I arrived at Mr. Harrison's law firm at exactly 8 o'clock. His office was old-fashioned, smelled of pipe tobacco and bound leather books, tucked away in a quiet brick building downtown. Arthur Harrison was in his late 60s, with thick silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a calm, immovable presence that instantly brought a wave of relief over me. He had been my grandfather's best friend and Grandma's attorney for 40 years. He didn't offer me tea or waste time on pleasantries. He walked over to his heavy mahogany desk, gestured for me to sit, and pointed to the blue diary I held in my hands. "Put it here, Clara," he said softly. I set the diary on the desk. Mr. Harrison reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a small bronze key, the match to the latch, and unlocked it. He opened the book, not to the first page, but to a thick envelope tucked into a pocket inside the back cover. "Did Richard sell the house?" Mr. Harrison asked, his voice low and steady. "The closing was finalized yesterday," I said, my voice tight. "A commercial developer bought it for cash. Richard said the deed transfer went through electronically. He told me the will reading today is just a formality because the trust owns everything now." A slow, cold smile spread across Mr. Harrison's face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a chess master watching his opponent walk directly into a checkmate they couldn't even see. "Richard is an arrogant man, Clara," Mr. Harrison said, leaning back in his leather armchair. "Arrogant men are wonderfully predictable. They read 3 paragraphs of a legal document, think they are corporate geniuses, and never stop to read the fine print." "What fine print?" I asked, leaning forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. He showed me the quitclaim deed from 5 years ago. He had power of attorney. "He had a conditional power of attorney," Mr. Harrison corrected gently, sliding a thick manuscript from a yellow folder on his desk. "And 5 years ago, when your grandmother signed that trust paperwork, she wasn't suffering from severe dementia, Clara. She was pretending." I stared at him, completely speechless. "What?" "Eleanor was old, but she was never stupid," Mr. Harrison explained, his eyes glinting behind his spectacles. "She knew 5 years ago that Richard was stealing money from her personal accounts. She caught him diverting her dividends into a shell company he created. Instead of confronting him and risking a messy court battle that would ruin the family name while she was alive, she came to me. Together, we laid a trap." Mr. Harrison tapped his finger on the blue diary. "The house in that trust, it was never the actual property deed. Your grandmother executed a land trust transfer 4 years ago, revoking the original power of attorney due to documented fiduciary fraud by Richard. She kept the revocation in a sealed court file, held right here in this district. Every document Richard signed with buyers over the past 3 weeks, every contract, every wire transfer, every land sale agreement, is legally fraudulent and utterly void. I caught my breath. So Richard doesn't own the house? Richard doesn't own a single blade of grass, Mr. Harrison said smoothly. In fact, by taking money from a buyer for a property he did not legally control, he has committed grand larceny, wire fraud, and real estate fraud. The moment he accepts that closing money into his account, he isn't a wealthy trustee. He's a felon. I sat in silence, the shock washing over me in waves. All those years I thought Grandma was fading. She was sitting quietly in her armchair, watching her greedy son dig his own grave, line by line, document by document. Why didn't she stop him earlier? I asked softly. Because Eleanor wanted them to reveal their true hearts, Mr. Harrison said quietly, his tone turning somber. She told me, Arthur, if my son turns out to be a good man, he will care for me and preserve my home. If he is a snake, he will try to sell my roof before I am even buried. Let him choose who he wants to be. And Richard chose. Mr. Harrison reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a single, pristine white envelope sealed with red wax. He slid it across the desk toward me. What is this? I asked. That, Mr. Harrison said, is the final instruction to be handed over at the conclusion of the will reading today. Your grandmother gave me strict instructions. I am to hand this envelope directly to Richard, Victoria, and Julian after I read the terms of the estate. Inside is a single letter written in her own hand. What does it say? Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his expression unreadable. It contains 2 words, Clara. 2 words that will destroy every financial dream your uncle has ever entertained. But before we deliver it, we have a funeral to attend. Let them celebrate their victory a little longer. The fall is much sweeter when they think they are standing on top of the mountain. By 11 o'clock that morning, the rain had settled into a thick, misty fog that hung low over St. Jude's Cemetery. The funeral was small. Grandma had outlived most of her lifelong friends, so the small hillside plot was populated mostly by distant relatives, a few neighbors, and the dark, looming figures of Uncle Richard, Aunt Victoria and Julian. They were dressed in pristine, expensive black designer clothes, bought, no doubt, on credit cards they expected to pay off with the house sale proceeds. Victoria stood near the casket, holding a black lace handkerchief, dabbing dry eyes and putting on a masterclass performance of tragic grief for the handful of elderly neighbors who had come to pay their respects. It's just so sudden, Victoria whimpered, her voice echoing softly under the cemetery tent. Eleanor was the heart of this family. We worked so hard to keep her comfortable in her final years. Richard gave up so much of his time. I stood on the opposite side of the grave, my arms folded tightly against the chill, watching her with cold detachment. I saw the way Julian kept checking his smart watch under his coat sleeve. I saw the way Richard was subtly pacing near the back of the tent, tapping his phone screen, checking his bank app to see if the buyer's escrow wire had cleared. They weren't mourning a mother or a grandmother. They were sitting at a transit station, waiting for a check to arrive. When the minister finished his short eulogy and the casket was lowered into the dark, damp earth, Richard didn't even wait for the final prayer to conclude. He immediately stepped toward the edge of the grave, dropped a single white rose onto the polished wood, and turned directly to Mr. Harrison, who was standing quietly near a marble tombstone with his leather briefcase in hand. Harrison, Richard said, his tone loud enough to draw the attention of the remaining guests. Let's skip the long morning walk. My family has a busy afternoon. Let's head to your office now and get the estate settlement wrapped up. Mr. Harrison looked over the top of his glasses at Richard, his expression entirely devoid of emotion. My office is not necessary, Richard, Mr. Harrison said calmly, his voice carrying over the quiet rustle of the trees. Your mother gave specific instructions regarding her last will and testament. She requested that the reading take place immediately following her burial in the private chapel right here on the cemetery grounds. Richard frowned, annoyed by the minor inconvenience. The chapel? Why? That's bizarre. Can't we just do this over email or in a proper boardroom? Eleanor was traditional, Mr. Harrison replied dryly. And as her legal executor, I follow her instructions to the letter. The chapel is unlocked. Shall we? Aunt Victoria sighed loudly, rolling her eyes as she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. Fine. Let's just get this over with. Julian, grab your coat. We have a 2:00 reservation at the steakhouse downtown to celebrate. To honor Eleanor's memory. They walked toward the small stone chapel at the edge of the cemetery grounds, high-heeled boots and polished dress shoes clicking on the cobblestone path. They walked with the light, buoyant steps of people who believed they were minutes away from dividing up a $500,000 fortune. I walked a few paces behind them, next to Mr. Harrison. Are you ready, Clara? Mr. Harrison asked softly without turning his head. I looked at the heavy oak doors of the chapel ahead, then down at the small red wax-sealed envelope tucked inside Mr. Harrison's briefcase. I've waited 5 years for this, I whispered. By 11 o'clock that morning, the rain had settled into a thick, misty fog that hung low over St. Jude's Cemetery. The funeral was small. Grandma had outlived most of her lifelong friends, so the small hillside plot was populated mostly by distant relatives, a few neighbors, and the dark, looming figures of Uncle Richard, Aunt Victoria and Julian. They were dressed in pristine, expensive black designer clothes, bought, no doubt, on credit cards they expected to pay off with the house sale proceeds. Victoria stood near the casket, holding a black lace handkerchief, dabbing dry eyes and putting on a masterclass performance of tragic grief for the handful of elderly neighbors who had come to pay their respects. It's just so sudden, Victoria whimpered, her voice echoing softly under the cemetery tent. Eleanor was the heart of this family. We worked so hard to keep her comfortable in her final years. Richard gave up so much of his time. I stood on the opposite side of the grave, my arms folded tightly against the chill, watching her with cold detachment. I saw the way Julian kept checking his smart watch under his coat sleeve. I saw the way Richard was subtly pacing near the back of the tent, tapping his phone screen, checking his bank app to see if the buyer's escrow wire had cleared. They weren't mourning a mother or a grandmother. They were sitting at a transit station, waiting for a check to arrive. When the minister finished a short eulogy and the casket was lowered into the dark, damp earth, Richard didn't even wait for the final prayer to conclude. He immediately stepped toward the edge of the grave, dropped a single white rose onto the polished wood, and turned directly to Mr. Harrison, who was standing quietly near a marble tombstone with his leather briefcase in hand. Harrison, Richard said, his tone loud enough to draw the attention of the remaining guests. Let's skip the long morning walk. My family has a busy afternoon. Let's head to your office now and get the estate settlement wrapped up. Mr. Harrison looked over the top of his glasses at Richard, his expression entirely devoid of emotion. My office is not necessary, Richard, Mr. Harrison said calmly, his voice carrying over the quiet rustle of the trees. Your mother gave specific instructions regarding her last will and testament. She requested that the reading take place immediately following her burial in the private chapel right here on the cemetery grounds. Richard frowned, annoyed by the minor inconvenience. The chapel? Why? That's bizarre. Can't we just do this over email or in a proper boardroom? Eleanor was traditional, Mr. Harrison replied dryly. And as her legal executor, I follow her instructions to the letter. The chapel is unlocked. Shall we? Aunt Victoria sighed loudly, rolling her eyes as she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. Fine. Let's just get this over with. Julian, grab your coat. We have a 2:00 reservation at the steakhouse downtown to celebrate. To honor Eleanor's memory. They walked toward the small stone chapel at the edge of the cemetery grounds, high-heeled boots and polished dress shoes clicking on the cobblestone path. They walked with the light, buoyant steps of people who believed they were minutes away from dividing up a $500,000 fortune. I walked a few paces behind them, next to Mr. Harrison. Are you ready, Clara? Mr. Harrison asked softly without turning his head. I looked at the heavy oak doors of the chapel ahead, then down at the small red wax-sealed envelope tucked inside Mr. Harrison's briefcase. I've waited 5 years for this, I whispered. Before Richard could even process the words on that card, the heavy double doors at the back of the chapel swung open with a deep, echoing thud. The cold outside air rushed into the warm room, accompanied by the heavy footfalls of 3 men in dark suits. Walking in front was a tall woman carrying a leather binder, flanked by 2 uniformed county sheriff deputies. Richard Vance, the woman called out, her voice hard and professional. Richard turned around slowly, looking like a man standing in front of a firing squad. Yes, I'm Richard Vance. I am Investigator Miller with the State Financial Crimes Unit, she said, stepping into the main aisle. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of grand larceny, scheme to defraud, falsification of land deeds, and wire fraud exceeding $400,000. No! Victoria screamed, springing up from her pew and throwing her hands into the air. There's been a mistake. This is a family matter. It's a disagreement over a will. Tell them, Arthur. Tell them it's just a civil dispute. It is not a civil dispute, Mrs. Vance, Investigator Miller replied calmly, signaling the two deputies. Your husband attempted to sell property owned entirely by an irrevocable trust under the sole ownership of Clara Vance. He deposited a commercial deposit check of $50,000 into his personal account 2 hours ago, a check drawn on interstate banking lines. That makes it a federal wire fraud offense. The two deputies stepped up to Richard. One of them pulled his arms behind his back, clicking the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sound, click, click, was the sweetest music I had ever heard. Clara! Richard screamed, twisting his head around as the deputies forced him to face the exit. Clara, talk to them. Tell them Eleanor was confused. Tell them you don't want this. We're family, Clara. We share the same blood. I stood in the center aisle, holding Grandma's 2-word note in my hand. I looked my uncle straight in the eye, the same man who, 24 hours ago, had threatened to have me arrested for stepping onto my grandmother's porch. Family doesn't sell a mother's home before she's buried, Uncle Richard. I said, my voice steady, cold, and utterly devoid of pity. You told me the real world doesn't run on tears, it runs on money. Well, welcome to the real world. You little bitch! Victoria shrieked, lunging toward me with her fingernails clawed out. Julian caught his mother by the shoulders, pulling her back as she sobbed hysterically. Mom, stop! Stop! You're making it worse. The commercial buyer has placed an immediate freeze on all assets associated with your family trust, Mr. Harrison added from the podium, his voice cutting through Victoria's screams like a scythe. And as the court-appointed administrator of Clara's trust, I will be filing a civil suit to recover every single dollar Richard stole from Eleanor's personal accounts over the last 5 years. Your cars, your suburban home, your liquid assets, everything will be attached to satisfy the restitution judgment. Julian looked at Mr. Harrison, his face pale with horror. What about my tuition? What about my car payment? I didn't sign anything. You knowingly accepted transfer payments from your father's shell company, Julian, Mr. Harrison said coldly. The forensic audit will determine your level of liability. I suggest you hire a criminal defense lawyer immediately. The deputies dragged us shouting, weeping Richard out of the chapel doors and into the misty rain, where the red and blue lights of 2 police cruisers were already flashing against the stone walls. Victoria collapsed into a pew, burying her face in her hands, her fake elegance completely shattered into pathetic, desperate sobs. Julian stood frozen in the aisle, looking around at the empty chapel, realizing that in less than 30 minutes, his family's wealth, reputation, and future had been burned to the ground. I turned my back on them. I walked past the crying woman and her ruined son, out through the heavy wooden doors, and stepped into the cool, fresh air. The rain had finally stopped. A single ray of golden sunlight broke through the heavy purple clouds, illuminating the green hillside where my grandmother rested. I walked over to her grave, stood before the dark earth, and took a deep breath. 3 months later, the developer's bulldozers never touched 412 Maple Street. With the legal chaos cleared and Richard facing a 4-year prison sentence following a guilty plea, the fraudulent sale was wiped from the public record. The house returned safely to the trust, where it had belonged all along. I spent the autumn months restoring the home. I replaced the locks, brought back the old wooden furniture from storage, and spent hours in the garden, turning the soil around Grandma's rose bushes, just as she had taught me when I was 7 years old. The greedy vultures who tried to devour her life were gone. Victoria was forced to downsize to a tiny rented apartment after their suburban house was liquidated to pay court-ordered restitution. Julian had dropped out of his expensive university, working 2 jobs to pay off the debts his father could no longer cover. They had sought to gain everything through deception, and in the end, they lost the only things that truly mattered, their freedom, their honor, and their family. One quiet Sunday afternoon, I sat on the front porch with a cup of hot tea, holding the blue leather diary in my lap. I turned to the very last page, a page written in Grandma's handwriting just weeks before she passed. "Dear Clara," the entry read, "if you are reading this, it means the storm has passed. Money is a strange thing, my sweet girl. It reveals who people truly are when they think no one is watching. Do not hold bitterness in your heart for Richard or Victoria. Pity them, for they believe that wealth is built on deeds, contracts, and bank accounts. But they are poor in every way that counts. This house was never just wood and brick. It was built on love, on sacrifice, and on the quiet moments we shared together. Keep the door open. Keep the garden growing. And remember that true justice is not about destroying your enemies. It is about preserving the things that are sacred." I closed the diary and looked out across the lawn. The autumn leaves were falling, painted in shades of brilliant gold and deep red, swirling in the cool breeze. For the first time in a very long time, the air felt light. The house was quiet, not with the silence of abandonment, but with the quiet peace of a home that had been saved. Moral of the story: voiceover narration, deep, philosophical closing thoughts. Greed is a disease that blinds people to the value of what they already possess. It convinces the foolish that they can outsmart time, truth, and love with clever schemes and heartless shortcuts. Uncle Richard thought he was a fox, but he forgot that a life built on betrayal is a house built on sand. When the winds of truth blow, even the grandest illusions come crashing down. In the end, you cannot steal a legacy. You cannot sell a home built on love to the highest bidder without paying the ultimate price. Because justice may walk slowly, but it never misses an appointment. Hold on to what is true. Protect those who protected you. And never forget that the greatest wealth you will ever own is a clear conscience and a heart that cannot be bought.